Greetings, ladies and metal-gents, and welcome to this narration of the web series The Lost Terran. If you are new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Part 16. Over the course of the next few days in Jump Space, Hunter learned 15 different games from Rix and his scroll. They varied from strategic to purely chance-based, and versus to independent to cooperative. Rix said that he downloaded as much in the way of games as he could get when he had volunteered for this colony mission. Not much chance to get back to the App Store, he said. Hunter managed to set up a few automated alerts as tests for themselves, and then tested going to sleep with them set. It had been enlightening, but Hunter couldn't place a logical reason as to why it had been that way. Hunter had taken some time to try and explain it to the Terran, but Rix had no answers, merely listened and provided some prompting and context for the Terran equivalents. It still helped. Hunter also looked at the time to bring up basic runes with Rix. Rix had been resistant, but given that a majority of the species used all basic runes to a certain degree, and more advanced runes being more dependent on the species involved, he set about learning. To assist, Hunter had worked with the mobile printer to produce a basic light-powered screen that was capable of displaying runes and communicating with the scroll. Building a basic GUI to allow the Terran to tap the equivalent rune with an associated label hadn't been difficult, but it was certainly much slower than Hunter was used to operating, since they had to think about the Terran's organic needs, needing to size the runes and labels without taking up the whole screen. In the end, Rix could demonstrate knowing the basics, but tended to refer to the scroll significantly, demonstrating more recall of given runes compared to actual knowing of the rune's intent reflexively. Hunter understood that this was part of organic learning process, but it was frustrating that the Terran couldn't use something other than that scroll. Hunter even asked why Rix didn't possess any cybernetics or implants of his own. Rix had replied that almost nobody who wasn't a Flix had either, unless they were certain professions. Plus, the TC pilots of any class, anything other than medical implants were strictly disallowed. TC didn't want pilots becoming reliant on technology over their own skills and instincts, leading to a much longer, more intensive training program than other regions. Hunter asked if the TCC had implants. Rix indicated that while the Plutes considered it, it was too expensive to justify when a worker was lost, since most implants had to be produced unique to the person in question. Between the two of them, they also set about devouring every bit of written information about the galaxy and the respective times. Rix's Rabhound Veterinary Handbook ended up revealing the complete feeding, care, and life cycle and more of Reggie, who was still in stasis at this point. Hunter was surprised to learn that the Rabhound was a genomic hybrid created to combine a Basset Hound and a Wallaby, both of which were heavily defined as part of the handbook. While heavily docile with Terrans, they were highly proficient and chasing prey towards Terrans for capture. This had made them especially useful in specimen collection on Xeno worlds. The handbook noted that because of their genomic modifications, this is not a fully comprehensive guide, and while Rabhounds were heavily resistant to various oils, acids/bases, and even outright chemical poisons, they were not impervious and so should be monitored closely following any specimen collection, particularly in less studied territories. Hunter ran a comparison of the Rabhound from the guide with what they recalled of the Galactic Society, and, as had been demonstrated by the Terran, comparatively speaking, Reggie, and those like him if they still existed, were on par with the Terrans, despite their smaller mass, with chemical resistance. Reggie wasn't a long-distance pursuit predator like the Terran, something that Rix had mentioned in comparison, but Rabhounds hadn't been created to be. They were intended to help in the colonization of new worlds. Rabhounds matched the vast majority of the Galactic Society in terms of size, but otherwise outperformed in a majority of metrics. Comparatively, though, they did not possess the necessary degree of neural matter to support more complex thought processes. Hunter felt that this type of uplift was perhaps cruel and expressed this concern with Rix. Rix's face had gotten very dark and had flashed as much more advanced rune for volcanic anger. He had then indicated that he cared for Reggie as much as he might a child, and that was anything but cruel. Hunter had let the subject drop and returned to reading. Rix had similarly let it drop after several hours. Hunter did recall that the TSC had had significant legal constraints with uplifts, particularly at the genomic level, so perhaps it made sense that Rix would be touchy about such statements. Other topics of discussion were explored naturally, with Rix spending a good chunk of time recounting various stories from his experiences and childhood. Munter gleaning all of the likely factual data from these stories as well as assessing behavioral information of Terrans, until it was time to emerge. Bryan enjoyed this quiet posting. It was little more than the outer system station designed to be able to respond to any reasonable local void emergencies. Being a Quinn, this was more than enough excitement for Bryan. After all, watching the various debris of the various mining operations saw past, ships passing by, various other Quinn, the strange kinds, doing who knows what with the various mining operations, and even those that had miscalibrated and landed in Bryan's little territory of Overwatch. Bryan didn't have any real authority per se. In theory they did, but that was only in case of an emergency. It still felt odd to Bryan being as far from their homeworld, but this was a successful, and above all, a quiet system relative to all others in Quinn space. If nothing else, it was good to be away from all those elders who insisted on holding massive debates on whom should be mated with whom, whose genomic structures bore the responsibility of carrying a certain traditions, and even what professions one should take. It was as if Quinn's journey into the void had had no impact on the Quinn, as if it were no more interest than the latest evening consumption. No, that wasn't true, thought Bryan. The latest evening consumption was of far more interest, especially given all the gossip which had undoubtedly been shared. The system beyond Bryan's little corner of it wasn't anything of particular note that Bryan was aware of, but they knew all the basic statistics by heart all the same. Their star was a K2-type red supergiant by the name of Nivet, and hadn't been charted in the skies of Quinn homeworld for over 15,000 years, at least in any sort of reliable stellar maps. There were only 5 planets, but they were several major debris fields which had likely been planets or at least planetoids at one point or another. At least one debris field he was believed to have been triggered 2 others, the first of which was likely caused by a random rogue space debris. 2 of the remainders were tolerable to Quinn, at least with the right equipment. Being high-gravity worlds and having equivalently high-pressure atmospheres, Quinn often required full support suits in order to be on the surfaces. Not that Quinn would want to be on such worlds without such full coverage suits. The first was a hot desert of a world, giving rise to thermals, which had inspiration to Quinn's writers, who dreamed of finding worlds where Quinn could fly effortlessly. Alas, the high gravity had given lie to this, and so while the counterweight station of the space elevator was always filled with technologies and dreamers, many left the system far more disillusioned than they had entered. The second was in fact a garden world, but one that had little in the way of usable land and associated perches, and seemed overly plentiful in water-based creatures who preyed on another readily. So, while the Quinn could in theory float on the water, firstly, one would never do so without being at full support suit, lest their feathers be flattened under the extreme gravity. Secondly, they would almost certainly be eaten in a matter of minutes. A small scientific station sat in orbit on the second tolerable world, content to provide observations of the species who rose and fell on the planet below. 2 of the other planets were gas giants and harbored massive refineries and shipping stations in orbits. This was where the bulk of the traffic was when Bryan had first arrived in system. They had arrived there and almost immediately felt themselves start to molt at the thought of having to care for the traffic demands from those stations. No, that duty had been given to others, young Quinn who wanted that kind of excitement. Bryan had arrived at their station by a special transport and met the outgoing Quinn by the name of Raccoon. Raccoon was returning to the homeworld for a brooding, their elders having insisted on it. Bryan's elders had no say in Bryan's life, at least not anymore. Bryan had been effectively cast out of their choice and profession, refusing to take up one in the traditional professions of the elders. It had bothered Bryan initially, but seemed to be so far away that Bryan often forgot about such concerns. The normal posting for a Quinn in the station was 4 months. Bryan had managed a comfortable 18 months without so much as an errant pin feather. Quinn leadership, elders themselves, but not Bryan's elders, had been understandably concerned that Bryan not feel forgotten nor exiled, and so had offered to take them into one of their houses, having demonstrated an adequate loyalty to duty and being remarkably adept at their profession. Bryan had politely refused, opting instead to take the occasional trip to the inner portion of the system where more Quinn were, as a kind of reminder as to what they had left behind. Even among the Quinn whose stations similarly segmented off the edge of the system in the event of emergencies, Blind was an oddity, an old-timer as one had put it before leaving after an 8-month stint, the end of which was being forced upon them as a concern for their behavior. No, Blind was quite happy to be left alone on the rim of the system along with the final planet, a frozen world that cracked and fractured constantly with various tidal forces brought to the 4 moons that encircled it. This wasn't to say that Blind did not want for company, but rather that very often they were all the company they truly needed. Each bimestral visit inward saw evidence of that. They would often purchase the latest in self-entertainment, even selecting new hobbies with which to occupy the time. The latest fad within Quinn culture was to decorate one's feathers with various beads. There was a trick to doing this, and Blind was still working on it, but had decided to partake in it all the same. It was an interesting fad, at least, compared with the fad of painting one's beak with various entirely unreal colorations. Blind had criticized in the privacy of their own station at seeing it initially hit the market, finding it ridiculous and hardly worth the effort. But it had stuck around for long enough that Blind had decided to try it. The first few attempts had been disasters, which had made Blind want to tear out the feathers in question, but they had molted out soon enough. In time, Blind had started getting better, having no skies in which to fly. Their wings had to be exercised in different ways, and so aerodynamics did not dictate which feathers they used to practice. Blind had also taken to reading about other species since taking over this posting. Galactic society was big, but at the same time largely insular. Species tended to stick to their own. It wasn't that there weren't stations with other species, and it wasn't even that various species didn't turn up within the systems, typically at shipping docks. It was more simply that species tended to stick to themselves, with the odd xenophile passing through, but rarely staying for more than even a year or two, themselves being driven onward to visit other species or to return to their own for various reasons, whether biochemical, medical, politics, or relations. Although, to Blind, the difference between relations and politics had always been a blur in the past. It still chased her, unwilling to let them live their life away from that, but it was a day-to-day part of Quinn's life. It seemed strange to them that the almost 400 years since Quinn had joined the galactic community and taken over custodianship of 10 systems, Quinn's culture had changed very little. There had been some new professions added to the traditions, but they were exceptions, not the rule. Only the more adventurous houses permitted such explorations. Proper Quinns of proper houses, under the stewardship of wise elders, took up the traditional professions, changing only when they must. It had taken the Quinn years to adjust to the influx of technologies brought by joining the galactic community, to accept that some of the professions had to radically change themselves in the face of certain technologies. Medicine had changed with the arrival of medical scanners, something many Quinn medical professionals had feared would make their professions vanish. Those Quinn who took risks and gambled in taking on new technologies had seen their houses' wealth expand 1,000-fold, bringing new entertainments and fads to every community. It annoyed Blind how stuck their house had been in looking at much the new technologies as fads and not seeking to elevate themselves as they should have sought to. But that was the wisdom of the elders, and they had been naught but a youngling, despite being almost 37 at that point. But Blind was here now. The station was Quinn-adapted one, taken from designs passed to the Quinn from the galactic community. This meant that while this was adequate comfortable for Blind and other Quinn, it still bore the hallmarks of having been built for another species, or perhaps by another one. Blind had never been too certain as to whether the station had been built by their people, or if another species had specialized in that. There was a constructor near the shipping station and the refining station, but it would have taken almost a year of constant output from the refining station to build a single shipping station, and while it was possible to upgrade the refining station, the Quinn who ran it were slow to make those changes, preferring instead to ensure adequate resources from when emergencies did arise or to capitalize on the need for already refined products in the nearby system. Blind could see the logic of this, but thought that it would be wiser for the station to focus on expansion at the same time, setting aside enough out of the output to expand and improve. Blind knew that it was likely more complicated than that, there being all manner of trade agreements that likely needed fulfillment and similar, but those had never been a particular concern for Blind. And today was just another average day for Blind. They had awakened in their nest of dried Rixba leaves, dined lightly on standard hibernation-stored mealworms, and exercised their wings before moving to their station. There was little traffic in the quadrant today. Odd miners who scanned for material-rich space debris and then collected a load for a long haul in the process. Typically houseless like Bryan, but respectable in their own way. Each of them knew of Bryan's responsibilities to watch over this area of the void. Several had inquired about cohorting or perhaps bonding, even if only temporary. Bryan had politely refused each case. Some of the Quinn had taken it less well than others, but none had committed to anything formal over the refusal. In theory, at least, nothing could be done formally from one houseless to another, but that also meant that the protections of the elders was that much less. This too had bothered Bryan initially, but given the peaceful nature of most Quinn, they did not feel that it was worth molting over, and it should have just been a quiet day too. Except for the Flash. There was no mistaking an FTL transition, but this one was as bright as though Bryan was anchored just off the star, not in the outer system. What happened next was almost disturbing. Every sensor on board the station screamed, hitting minimum and maximum limits in matters of seconds. Every computing station flickered, and even the superstructure of the station seemed to shudder, despite no obvious connection between the disturbing bright light and station. Had Bryan not been at their station, they'd have no idea what was happening. Even standing at their station, they had no idea what manner of craft it might be. They were only able to gauge by eye as to just how far away the Flash was, the screens and sensors being utterly overwhelmed by, whatever it was. And then it was over. The Flash was gone, and the systems all read as normal. And in the space where the Flash had been was a large seed-shaped ship that was over half the size of Bryan's station. End of chapter. I would quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and Patreons: Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Lord Azrekahl, Dragzoon W.R.E, Holly's sister, Arcadian. Thank you very much.